The prairie wind carried dust and silence across the wide Wyoming valley, where a man named Caleb Warren had learned to live without expecting much from life. At 35, his days were measured by the rhythm of hooves, the scrape of a shovel, and the slow drift of cattle beneath the orange sun. The Civil War had taken his brother, drought had taken half his herd, and loneliness, well, that had taken the rest of him. He was a man content with quiet work and quiet sorrow, until the letter came. It was mid-morning when he found it on the porch, weighted beneath a small stone. The handwriting was neat and curved, a woman's hand by the look of it, and though he'd never seen the name before, Miss Clara Whitlow, Missouri, the words inside would soon change every inch of his world. It was from a preacher's wife who ran a correspondence service for mail-order marriages. She wrote kindly, with words dipped in hope, explaining that a young woman of good standing had been chosen for him after his name had been submitted, by someone he didn't know, months ago. The girl, she said, had agreed to come west as his bride, and her train would arrive in Cheyenne in 2 weeks' time. Caleb read the letter twice, then again, each time thinking it must have been meant for another man. A bride, he hadn't asked for one. Lord knew he wouldn't dare. He had a roof that leaked and a ranch that barely fed him, and he'd buried too many hopes to think of a wife. Yet the name, the description, and even his own address were right there in ink, proof that this strange miracle had somehow found him. He stood on that porch for a long while, the letter trembling slightly in his calloused hands, his mind chasing ghosts of old dreams. That night, he didn't sleep much. He thought about the kind of woman who'd answer a mail-order notice, a desperate one, surely, or maybe just one seeking a chance. The preacher's wife had said she was 19, sweet-tempered, educated, and skilled with sewing and piano. 19. He could scarcely picture what a girl that young would make of his rough land, his silent house, his scarred hands. It wasn't right, he told himself. He was too old, too set in his ways, and yet a spark, a strange forbidden hope, lit in his chest like the glow of a match in the dark. He spent the next days pretending he wasn't thinking about her. But everything he did, the fixing of a fence, the scrubbing of the hearth, even the trimming of his beard, felt like a silent preparation for something his heart hadn't allowed in years. He oiled the hinges on the front door, mended the quilt on the bed, and even found the small wooden comb that had belonged to his late mother. It had sat untouched for 15 years in a drawer, gathering dust like the memory of affection. He placed it on the washstand, not sure why, but something told him it belonged there now. The morning the train was due, the world seemed clearer somehow. The clouds were stretched thin across the sky, like someone had brushed them with silver, and the air smelled of sage and iron. Caleb hitched his wagon and rode toward Cheyenne, the wheels humming over hard earth. He kept rehearsing what he'd say when he saw her, how he'd explain the mix-up, how he'd pay her fare home if she wanted to leave. He wasn't a cruel man, and he wouldn't let some girl's life get tangled in his mistakes. The depot was busy that day. Freight cars rattling, men shouting, women clutching parasols against the wind. Caleb stood by the post with his hat in hand, feeling as awkward as he ever had. When the train hissed to a stop, steam rolled like fog, and passengers began stepping down. Families, soldiers, old widows with trunks. Then he saw her. She was small, barely reaching his shoulder, dressed in a pale blue traveling dress that looked like it had seen better days but still held its dignity. Her bonnet shaded her face, but when she lifted her head, her eyes caught the sun, the color of honey warmed by firelight. She looked frightened but not weak, nervous but determined. When their gazes met, Caleb forgot the speech he'd rehearsed. For a heartbeat, the noise of the world fell away. "Mr. Warren?" she asked softly, her voice a melody wrapped in dust. I'm Clara Whitlow." He opened his mouth but found no words. For a man who'd talked to the wind and the stars for years, silence had always been easy, but now it weighed heavy. He nodded once, slow and unsure, as she smiled faintly, out of politeness maybe, or bravery. Her gloved hands clutched a small carpet bag, the kind that held a life in miniature. "I hope you don't mind," she continued, glancing around the depot. "The preacher's wife said you'd be expecting me. I know it's sudden." Caleb cleared his throat, the truth scratching at his tongue. "Ma'am, there's been a mistake." The words hung there, almost cruel in the open air. But then she looked at him, Not with shock or offense, but with something that steadied him. "Maybe," she said softly. "But maybe not. I prayed for a place to belong, Mr. Warren. Maybe the good Lord just sent me here instead." And just like that, the hard edges of his world softened. He saw in her not a burden, but a light, young and unsure, yet brighter than the wide Wyoming sky. He took her bag, careful not to touch her hand too long, and led her toward the wagon. The ride home was quiet. She asked about the land, the cattle, the mountains rising like blue ghosts in the distance. He answered short and simple. Every word felt like a fragile bridge being built between two strangers who didn't yet know if it would hold. But when she smiled, softly, bravely, Caleb felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he caught himself imagining tomorrow not as a burden, but as a promise. And though he didn't know what would come next, as the sun sank behind the ridges and the wind whispered through the sage, he found himself hoping, dangerously, foolishly, that this mistake might just be the only thing in his life that had ever been right. The road from Cheyenne to the Warren Ranch stretched like an endless ribbon of gold and dust, the afternoon sun blazing low over the plains. Clara Whitlow sat beside Caleb in the creaking wagon, her gloved fingers clasped neatly in her lap. She didn't fidget or chatter. She simply looked out at the wide-open world with that quiet wonder of someone seeing freedom for the first time. Caleb noticed how the wind lifted loose strands of her hair, soft chestnut curls escaping the bonnet, and how her eyes followed the distant line of mountains with something close to awe. He'd forgotten what that kind of looking felt like, the way hope could paint beauty into every mile of barren land. He wanted to ask her things about her home, her family, what made her come all this way, but words stuck behind his teeth. The truth was, he didn't know how to speak to a girl so young and unspoiled. The women he'd known before were older, hardened by the same West that had weathered him. But Clara looked like springtime had taken human form, delicate yet alive in a place where most things grew from stone. When they reached the ranch, evening had begun to stain the horizon in lavender. The small homestead came into view, a cabin of gray timber and a barn that leaned just enough to show its years. It wasn't much to look at, not by any civilized measure. The fence posts stood crooked, the porch needed mending, and the well creaked like an old mule. But it was his, built by his own hands after the war, every nail driven with sweat and stubbornness. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop and stepped down, offering her a hand. She hesitated only a second before taking it, her palm small and cool against his rough skin. "It's quieter than I imagined," she said softly, her eyes moving over the land. He nodded. "Most things out here are." Inside, the cabin was clean but bare. A stone hearth stood cold, and the wooden table held only a single chair. He hadn't thought to bring another. He cursed himself silently for that. Clara, though, didn't seem to notice. She wandered to the window, touching the sill like it was a thing of wonder. "It smells of pine," she murmured, smiling faintly. "Like home should." Something in him loosened. "Ain't much, but you're welcome to it as long as you need," he said. She turned toward him, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Warren, did you really not expect me?" Her question hit like a quiet bullet. He looked away, jaw tightening. "No, ma'am. Didn't expect anyone. Don't rightly know how it happened." "I see." She nodded slowly, her fingers brushing her skirt. "Then I suppose it's a good thing I'm used to surprises?" That answer, simple, brave, made him look at her again. She stood there in the fading light, her cheeks flushed from the wind, her eyes bright but uncertain. There was no trace of anger in her, only a kind of patience that unsettled him more than fury would have. He couldn't tell whether she was foolish or simply made of stronger faith than most people he'd known. He lit the lamp and set it on the table. The flame flickered, casting a soft gold glow across her face. "You can take the bedroom," he said. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." She hesitated, then smiled in that shy way of hers. "Thank you, but if you don't mind, I'll help make supper first. You don't have to." "I know," she interrupted gently, "but I'd like to." And just like that, she moved toward the small cupboard and began to work. Her motions were careful and graceful, though he could tell she was new to frontier life. She found the pot, fetched water from the bucket, and even managed to coax a fire to life after a few uncertain tries. Caleb watched in silence as she stirred the beans and salt pork he'd set aside, humming a tune that drifted through the room like soft rain. It had been years since anyone had cooked here besides him. The air filled with the smell of wood smoke and something sweet. Her perfume, faint but comforting, like lilac after a storm. When she turned to hand him a tin plate, their fingers brushed again. It was the smallest thing, but he felt it deep, a warmth he hadn't known in years spreading through his chest. They ate quietly, the fire snapping in the hearth. She asked about the ranch, about the nearest town, about how he spent his winters. He answered in short, plain words, but she didn't seem to mind. Every so often her laughter would light up the small room, soft and unforced. It did something strange to him, made the cabin feel larger somehow, alive again. After supper she tidied the dishes, humming as she worked. Caleb stepped outside needing air. The stars were spilling out above the prairie, cold and bright, and the night wind carried the scent of sagebrush. He leaned against the post, trying to quiet the tangle in his chest. She was just a girl, kind, polite, misplaced by some clerical mistake. He'd see her safe until they figured it out. That was all. But even as he told himself that, his heart didn't listen. When he went back inside, the lamp was turned low, and Clara sat by the fire with her knees drawn close, wrapped in one of his wool blankets. She looked up as he entered, her face glowing in the firelight. "I've never seen stars like that before," she whispered. "It makes you feel small, but in a good way." He nodded, unsure what to say. "The sky's bigger out here," he said finally. "Makes most things seem smaller." "Not everything," she replied. Her gaze met his, steady, curious, searching. "Some things feel bigger, too, like faith or kindness." He looked away first, pretending to tend the fire. The way she said those words, gentle, unashamed, struck something deep in him, something he thought he'd buried with his youth. When she finally rose and went to the small bedroom, she paused at the doorway. "Good night, Mr. Warren," she said softly. "Good night, Miss Whitlow." And when the door closed, the silence that followed didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive, humming with something he couldn't name. He sat there a long while, staring at the dying fire. Outside, coyotes sang to the moon and the wind whispered through the dry grass. He thought of her small hands stirring the pot, of her eyes catching the firelight, of her quiet courage to stand in a stranger's home without trembling. There was something about her that didn't belong to this rough land, and yet, maybe that's what the land needed. For the first time in years, Caleb Warren bowed his head and whispered a prayer, not for rain, not for fortune, but for guidance. Because he knew then that the hardest thing about this young girl's arrival wouldn't be sending her away. It would be learning how to let her stay. The next morning broke soft and gold, sunlight spilling through the cracks in the cabin walls like warm honey. Caleb woke to the faint sound of humming and the smell of bread baking, something he hadn't known in so long he thought he might be dreaming. For a man who usually started his day with black coffee and silence, the melody that drifted through the house made him pause halfway through lacing his boots. He stepped quietly to the doorway, and there she was. Clara stood by the stove, her hair loose now, brushing her shoulders in soft waves. She wore a plain cotton dress he'd found in a trunk, his late mother's, mended with her own careful stitches, and an apron tied at the waist. She was humming that same lilting tune from the night before, light as a sparrow's breath as she kneaded dough on the counter. Morning sunlight framed her like a painting, turning the dust in the air into a shimmer of gold. When she turned and saw him, she startled, then laughed softly. "Oh, I didn't mean to wake you." The door hinge creaked something awful. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly aware of his unshaven jaw and tangled hair. "You didn't, I just wasn't expecting a breakfast," she teased gently. "Well, I figured you could use more than coffee." He managed a small, crooked smile. "You figured right." That morning they ate together at the table, two people who'd been strangers yesterday, now bound by the quiet rhythm of shared space. The bread was uneven and a little too crisp on the edges, but to Caleb it tasted like something holy. He found himself studying her as she talked, her words soft but full of life. She spoke of Missouri, of the small church where her father had preached before he died, of the years she'd spent helping her mother care for others until sickness took her too. She said it without complaint, without bitterness, as if sorrow had simply taught her how to be gentle. Caleb listened, saying little, but every word she spoke seemed to fill some empty place in him. When she asked about the ranch, he showed her the lay of the land. The creek that wound through the back pasture, the barn that leaned like an old man, the small corral where the horses waited for feed. She followed him everywhere, her skirts brushing the tall grass, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" she asked once, her gaze sweeping the endless fields. He hesitated before answering. "Used to. Guess I just got used to it." "I don't think people are meant to get used to loneliness," she said quietly. "It's like the cold. You can stand it for a while, but sooner or later it takes something from you." Her words lingered long after they went back to work. He showed her how to draw water from the well, how to carry wood, how to milk the cow without spilling a drop. She listened carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration, her laughter breaking free whenever she made a mistake. More than once he caught himself smiling at her clumsy determination. As the days turned to weeks, they settled into a rhythm that neither of them had planned. She cooked, cleaned, and tended the small garden, planting herbs she'd brought in a cloth pouch from home. He repaired the barn roof, mended tack, and took her with him when he rode to check the herd. She'd sit in the wagon with her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes wide as she watched the hills roll out before them. One afternoon, a storm came sudden and wild, tearing across the valley with a fury only the west could muster. Caleb rushed to drive the cattle toward shelter, shouting over the roar of thunder. When he turned, he saw Clara standing by the barn door, rain soaking her dress as she tried to hold it shut against the wind. "Get inside," he yelled, running toward her. "I'm trying," she called back, laughing through the chaos. He reached her just as the wind tore the latch free, and together they forced the door closed. For a moment they stood there, breathless, drenched, and too close. Her hair clung to her cheeks, her eyes bright with the thrill of it all. He could feel her heartbeat through the soaked fabric of her dress, quick and alive. "Reckless girl," he muttered, half a growl, half a prayer. She smiled up at him, unafraid. "Maybe, but I'm not as fragile as you think." That smile did something to him, something he couldn't undo. He stepped back quickly, running a hand through his wet hair, and busied himself with the feed barrels. She turned away too, but he saw the faint color rising in her cheeks. When the storm passed, the world smelled clean again, fresh rain on sage and earth. The sunset that followed was fierce and red, and for the first time in years, Caleb felt the ache of beauty too sharp to bear. He found Clara standing by the porch, watching the sky, her arms wrapped around herself. "Never seen colors like that," she said softly, "like the heavens are on fire." He stood beside her, his voice low. "Out here, everything burns sooner or later." She looked at him then, really looked, her expression full of something he couldn't name. "Maybe that's how God purifies things," she said. Through the burning, he didn't answer. He couldn't, because in that moment he knew she was changing him. Just by being there, by seeing beauty where he saw hardship, by finding grace in a land that had beaten the softness out of him. As night fell, she brought out her mother's worn Bible and read by lamplight, her voice steady and calm. Caleb sat near the fire listening. He wasn't a churchman, hadn't prayed much since the war, but the sound of her voice made the words feel like truth again. When she looked up from the page, their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the world went still. He turned away first, as always. But later, when he lay on the cot near the hearth, listening to the wind through the cracks, he couldn't stop thinking about her, how she laughed, how she prayed, how she looked at the world as if it could still surprise her. And in the quiet dark, Caleb Warren, who had sworn he was done with hope, realized something both terrifying and beautiful. He was falling in love with the girl he'd never meant to meet. Summer settled heavy over the valley, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and the cattle restless. Days stretched long and the work never seemed to end. But for Caleb, the weight of labor no longer felt the same. The ranch still demanded him, but so did the strange, quiet pull that came every time Clara smiled. She'd been with him near 2 months now, long enough that he could no longer imagine the house without her humming through it, or the fields without the sight of her skirts fluttering near the garden. Yet every moment she was near, a war waged inside him, one side yearning toward her light, the other reminding him he had no right to reach for it. He told himself she deserved better, a young man, a proper home, a future not built on old regrets, but telling himself didn't stop the ache. He'd catch himself watching her while she hung laundry, the breeze teasing her hair into wild curls. Or when she read by lamplight, her lips moving faintly with the words. He noticed everything, the way she tilted her head when thinking, the way she bit her lip when concentrating, the way her laughter could scatter his gloom like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. One evening, after a long day mending fences, Caleb came back to find her sitting on the porch steps, sewing a tear in her dress. The sunset bathed her in gold and rose, and for a moment he stopped in his tracks, his chest tight. She looked up, catching his gaze, and smiled in that easy, gentle way that made the whole world slow down. "You look tired," she said softly. "Always am," he replied, dropping his hat beside him as he sat on the step below her. She laughed. "Then you're living right. My pa used to say a man who's never tired isn't worth much." He grunted, amused despite himself. "Your pa sounds like he worked harder than most preachers I've known." "He did," she said, her eyes softening. "He said God listens best when a man's hands are busy." They sat in silence after that, the sound of crickets rising from the tall grass. Caleb found himself wishing the moment could stretch forever. The air between them felt alive, charged with something unspoken, and that scared him. When he finally stood to go inside, Clara touched his sleeve. Just a brush light as breath, but it stopped him. "You don't have to keep your distance, you know," she said quietly. "I'm not made of glass." Her words hit deep. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze. "You don't understand, Clara. I ain't a man fit for kindness?" She interrupted. "For company? For a little happiness?" He swallowed hard. "For you." The silence that followed felt as wide as the prairie. She looked at him for a long time, her eyes shining, not with tears but with something like courage. Then she smiled faintly and said, "You keep deciding what I deserve, Mr. Warren. Maybe one day you'll let me decide for myself." He didn't sleep that night. Every word she'd spoken burned in his chest. He'd spent his life believing some things were beyond reach: peace, tenderness, love. But this girl had walked into his loneliness like she'd been sent to prove him wrong. Still, he couldn't allow himself to want what he wanted, not when she was so young, and he was a man marked by years and scars she couldn't understand. A week later, trouble came riding. The nearest rancher, a man named Virgil Haskins, had been sour toward Caleb ever since a boundary dispute the previous year. When Haskins' cattle broke through the fence and wandered onto Caleb's land, he came storming up the road with a rifle slung over his shoulder and bitterness in his eyes. Clara was hanging wash when she saw the dust cloud rising. Caleb stepped out to meet it. Haskins reined in hard, spitting dust and venom. "Heard you got yourself a bride, Warren." "Pretty little thing for a man your age." His tone was a sneer wrapped in cruelty. "How much she cost you?" Caleb's jaw tightened, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver, though he didn't draw it. "You'd best leave my property, Haskins." "Just making conversation," the man said, grinning mean. "Seems strange, though. Girl that young, living with an old war ghost like you. Folks in town been talking." Before Caleb could answer, Clara stepped forward, calm as Sunday morning. "Then the folks in town should find better things to talk about," she said evenly. "Mr. Warren is a good man and I don't answer to gossip." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Caleb wanted to step in, to shield her, but she didn't need it. The look she gave Haskins could have cut through stone. The rancher sneered one last time, spat in the dirt, and turned his horse around. When he was gone, Caleb turned to her. "You shouldn't have stood up for you?" she asked, eyes flashing. "What kind of wife would I be if I didn't?" The word wife hung between them, heavy as thunder. She blushed then, realizing what she'd said. Caleb's breath caught, and for a moment neither of them could look away. He broke it first, muttering, "You ought to stay clear of men like him. The West don't take kindly to women speaking their minds." "Then the West needs better men," she replied simply. Her words lingered like perfume long after she'd gone inside. That night, Caleb couldn't shake the sight of her standing proud and unflinching in the face of cruelty. She was still young, yes, but strong, in a way that shamed his doubt. Days passed, and the air between them grew thick with things unsaid. One evening, while fixing the lantern outside, Caleb caught her reflection in the window. Watching him, her eyes full of something he didn't dare name. He turned, wiping his hands. "Clara," he began, his voice rough. "You know I didn't ask for a wife." "I know," she said softly, stepping closer. "But maybe you needed one." The world seemed to stop. Her nearness, the way her voice trembled, the way her gaze held his, it undid him. For the first time in years, he let the wall crack. His hand lifted halfway toward her cheek before he caught himself, fingers curling back like a man afraid of fire. "I can't," he whispered. Not when I can't promise you anything but hardship." She looked at him with that quiet, disarming grace. "Then promise me that. Promise me the truth. I'd rather have a hard life beside you than a soft one without meaning." He had no words, none that could answer what her heart had just offered. So he did the only thing he could. He stepped back, turned toward the open door and whispered, "You don't know what you're saying, girl." But as he walked into the night, the stars burning cold and far above him, he realized she did. She knew exactly what she was saying. It was he who didn't yet have the courage to believe her. And that was the cruelest kind of fear. The kind that came not from danger or loss, but from the unbearable hope of being loved again. Autumn crept in slowly that year, softening the edges of summer with cool wind and the scent of ripened hay. The valley turned to gold under the sun, and the cottonwoods shimmered like coins in a riverbed. Caleb felt the change everywhere, in the earth, in the sky, and deep in his chest where something warm had begun to grow despite all his attempts to stop it. Days passed gentle now, marked by the easy rhythm of shared chores and quiet laughter. Clara's presence filled every corner of the ranch. The cabin smelled faintly of bread and lilac, the porch was swept, and the table always held a small vase of wildflowers she gathered by the creek. Yet the peace he felt carried a strange weight. He loved her. He knew it the way a man knows when rain is coming, but he hadn't said the words. Pride held him back, fear too. What if he wasn't enough? What if she woke one morning and saw him as he saw himself? An old, weathered man with too much past and too little future. Every time he thought of confessing, the words turned to dust on his tongue. Then came the day the mare went into labor. It was just before dawn, the sky still pale with frost, when Caleb heard the distressed whinny from the barn. He threw on his coat and rushed out, lantern swinging. Clara was already there, barefoot in her nightdress and shawl, her breath clouding in the cold. "I heard her," she said, eyes wide. "She's in trouble." Together they worked for hours, the chill biting through their clothes as they coaxed and soothed the panicked mare. Clara's hands trembled but never faltered. She whispered softly to the animal, her voice steady and kind. When the foal finally slid into the straw alive and breathing, Clara laughed, a sound so full of relief and joy that Caleb thought it might split his heart. She looked at him through tears, face lit by the lantern glow, and for that instant all the doubts in his soul fell silent. He reached for her without thinking. His hand found her cheek, warm and damp with sweat and tears. She didn't pull away. The air between them shimmered with the heat of everything they'd left unsaid. "Clara," his voice broke, "you deserve more than a man like me." She shook her head, eyes shining. "You're the only man who ever made me feel safe." He swallowed, thumb brushing a tear from her skin. "Safe ain't the same as loved." "I know," she whispered, stepping closer until her breath touched his. "That's why I stayed." Something inside him gave way then. The wall he'd built from grief, from guilt, from all the years of thinking life had passed him by. He bent his head and kissed her, slowly, reverently, like a man who'd forgotten the language of tenderness and was learning it again. The world fell away. No barn, no cold, no pastime, only her, warm and bright against the dark. When they pulled apart, she smiled through tears. "You waited so long to speak, Mr. Warren." He managed a breathless laugh. "Didn't think I still knew how." From that day forward, something shifted between them. The house no longer felt like a stop along a lonely road. It felt like home. They planted late-season wheat together, mended fences side by side, and in the evenings read aloud by the fire. Sometimes, when the wind howled across the plains, Caleb would find her curled on the porch swing, wrapped in his coat, staring at the stars. He'd sit beside her and she'd rest her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked once. "Coming here?" She smiled softly. "Only that it took so long for you to believe I was meant to." He chuckled, tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "Guess I ain't quick at learning happiness." "Then it's a good thing I'm patient," she said, and the look she gave him was pure sunlight. Winter came early, bringing snow that blanketed the valley in silence. They faced it together, hauling wood, feeding stock, laughing over burnt bread and frozen water buckets. For the first time in years, Caleb found himself singing under his breath while he worked. He'd catch Clara smiling at him from the doorway, and he'd feel that familiar ache of gratitude, for her faith, for her laughter, for the chance to begin again when he'd thought beginnings were done. On Christmas Eve, with the wind rattling outside, he reached into the drawer of his mother's old dresser and pulled out a small box he'd kept hidden for weeks. Inside was a simple silver ring, plain, sturdy, meant to last. Clara was by the fire, mending his coat when he knelt beside her. "Clara Whitlow," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You came here a stranger. You turned my house into a home, my silence into peace. I ain't got fancy words or riches to give, but what I've got is yours. If you'll have it." She looked up, eyes wide and glistening. "Caleb, are you sure?" He smiled, that slow, rare smile that reached his eyes. "Never been sure of anything." Her hands trembled as he slid the ring onto her finger. "Then yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. They sealed the promise with another kiss, and soft, unhurried, full of everything they'd learned together about forgiveness and faith. The fire crackled beside them. The snow whispered against the window, and outside the world felt new. By spring, word spread through the valley that Caleb Warren had finally married. Some said the old rancher had gone soft. Others said he'd gone lucky. But those who visited the Warren place saw something truer. Two souls who'd found shelter in each other after too many storms. The house stood straighter now, the fields greener, and laughter carried farther on the wind. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Caleb would watch Clara walking along the fence line, the setting sun catching her hair. He'd think about the letter that started it all, a letter meant for someone else maybe, or maybe not. He no longer questioned fate. He'd learned that some blessings arrive in disguise, that grace often rides in on the same dust the world calls mistake. And when Clara came back to him, smiling, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing, he'd whisper the truth he'd once been too afraid to say. "I wasn't expecting you, Clara, but I reckon I was waiting for you all the same." She'd laugh softly, squeezing his hand. "Then it's a good thing I came." The prairie wind would sigh through the grass, and the horizon would glow like promise, endless, wild, and theirs.